That was why by 1800 you could hardly see a single Portuguese at the shores of Africa, because at that time all of them had to flee. So because of the malaria that was killing them. But quinine was discovered in the early part of 19th century. So as a result of that, due to the effectiveness of quinine that helped them to prevent malaria, then they had to so they came to Africa with boldness. So it shows that if you are saying, for example, that slavery is a moral burden, then colonialism is even worse than even slavery.
Let's begin this conversation taking a quote from Abraham Lincoln, who was an American lawyer, politician, and statesman, served as the 16th president of the United States from 1861 until his assassination in 1865. He once said, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves." And he also stated that whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. Absolutely spot on. Let's see how this quote relates to what we'll be discussing today. Very warm greetings and welcome to The Conversation, reaching you from Kaftan's television studio here in the nation's capital, Abuja. I am Annabelle Oji. Today, the International Day for Abolition of Slavery, 2nd December, marks the date of the adoption by the General Assembly of the United Nations Convention for the Suppression of Trafficking Persons. The focus of this day is on eradicating contemporary forms of slavery, such as trafficking in persons, sexual exploitation, and the worst forms of child labor, forced marriage, and the forced recruitment of children for use in armed conflict. Now, what are the main forms of modern slavery? Slavery has evolved and manifested itself in different ways throughout history. Today, some traditional forms of slavery still persist in their earlier forms, while others have been transformed into new ones. The UN human rights bodies have documented the persistence of old forms of slavery that has embedded in traditional beliefs and customs. These forms of slavery are the result of long-standing discrimination against the most vulnerable groups in the society, such as those regarded as being of low caste, tribal minorities, and indigenous people. Let's talk about forced labor. Alongside traditional forms of forced labor such as bonded labor and debt bondage, there now exist more contemporary forms of forced labor such as migrant workers who have been trafficked for economic exploitation of every kind in the world, in the world economy, work in domestic servitude, the construction industry, the food and garment industry, the agricultural sector, and in forced prostitution. We move to child labor. Now, globally, 1 in 10 children works, and that's it. The majority of child labor that occurs today is for economic exploitation. That goes against the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which recognize, and quote, "The right of the child is to be protected from economic exploitation and from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or to interfere with the child's education or to be harmful to the child's health or physical or mental, spiritual, moral, or social development." End of quote. Let's shift our attention to trafficking. Now, according to the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, trafficking in persons means the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation includes prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or removal of organs. The consent of the person trafficked for exploitation is irrelevant, and if the trafficked person is a child, it is a crime, even without the use of force. Now, today, we join the rest of the world as we lend our voices to this call on end or to abolition of slavery, be it modern day slavery, traditional or contemporary slavery. And my guest on the show today is Stephen Adewale, who is an historian. We will be having this conversation with him. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a fresh Saturday morning, so go grab a seat, get your cup of water or freshly made juice or maybe a glass of anything that works for you. and let's have this conversation with Stephen Adewale. Welcome to The Conversation, and I will be your host. Welcome back. If you just joined us, this is The Conversation. We are reaching you from Kaftan's television studio here in the nation's capital, Abuja. Now, I said Nigeria joins the rest of the world to commemorate International Day of Abolition of Slave Trade. We are lending our voice to that call as we'll start here in the studio. And my guest on the show today is Stephen Adewale. He is a historian. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Okay, now let's talk about slave trade. But first, before we talk about any other thing, we'll first of all try to get at least probably synopsis or history on how slave trade, how it started, because now we're looking at the African and the Nigerian story. So I had one argument one time. And then some people said this, I don't want to call tribes, but some people said this particular tribe, you all were slaves at some point, and then some came out to say that this particular tribe, you were all slaves, so you don't even have a right to even say anything. Looking back at history with regards to slave trade in Africa generally and Nigeria specifically, how far have we gone as a country and as a continent?
Thank you, Annabelle. I think I will start by appreciating the United Nations organization because the organization has been able to survive for 78 years because they put the interest of those who had been traumatized in the past into consideration. Before the UNO, we had the League of Nations, which was established in 1918. And one of the reasons why the League of Nations failed was because the League of Nations failed to consider the interest of those who had been victimized in the past. But the United Nations has been able to do better. And though it was a bit late, because when the organization was established in 1945, one of the agitations, one of the arguments by different scholars from across the world at the time was that a day like this should be declared, it should be officially recognized. But it wasn't recognized until December 2nd, 1986. The fact that it was recognized and year in, year out, the United Nations organization has been able to project the days, and they've been able to look back into what has happened in the past and to declare that something that never in history again would something like this ever happened. So we have to applaud them. Though the more is still required.
I was going to ask
in the sense that when we are talking of
regard.
slavery, in the real sense of it, slavery is still very much with us. It's only that it's no longer with us in the kind of in a form that it used to be.
Yeah, you have the chains and all
that we used to have in the time past. So, but we still need to appreciate them because they are taking the right step in the right direction, and we can only hope that with time that the right thing will be done. Now, the word slavery itself is ugly in any form, but we shouldn't make it look like probably it has not been with us for a very long time. In fact, slavery has been with us from the time immemorial. Before the advent of the slave trade, we've had slavery. A lot of people had been enslaved either through captivity or as debtors or even indigent poor. It has always been there. In fact, even the word slavery itself, if you look at the etymology of the word slavery, you know that it actually came from emanated from Slav. Because aside the word, it has been there, but we did not really have name. Attached name to it until about 9th century when the Roman Empire decided to enslave the entire region in the continent that we know as Europe today. Now, today, those regions, they were known as Slavs. Now, those Slavs, there are countries like Russia, Belarus, Czech Republic, Romania, about 13 different countries in that axis. So they were all enslaved by the Roman Empire. So it shows that it's not only the slave trade, that it's not only Africa that had been traumatized in the past. It's a good number of countries, even in Europe, had actually been traumatized. Okay. So, but it took a new turn in about 15th century when the Europeans came to Africa and they started taking our people out of the continent to different parts of the world, and they started using them as plantation farmers. So it took a new turn. Now, when you now look at Africa from that about 1550 till about 1800, when that slave trade eventually ended. It's actually on both sides, because people had argued that, look, that the Europeans had actually enslaved us, but people actually also, some other also argued, especially those who are advocates of Europeans enslavement, they said, look, that we did not come to the interior, that what we only did was for us to come to the border, and your people actually sold your people to us, and we paid them. So the argument was that the money paid that we paid, that you people should have used that money to develop your region. But when you actually look at that argument, because about 12.1 million people were actually enslaved from Africa, and if you look at the age of this, the age range of these individuals, you know, they were between many of them were taken out of Africa even as early as 5 years old. One of the people who actually championed the abolition of slave trade, known as Olaudah Equiano, he was taken out of Africa at the age of 4 years old. Many of them did not even know the country where they came from. That's why by the time they get there, many of them will only bear the name of their masters. So in a region where you took about people from 4 years to 39 years old, and you took them out of that continent, and you took 12.1 million, at least 12.1 million of them out of that region, definitely it's going to affect the development of that region, because even researchers and scholars and scientists have made us to understand that for a country to develop, you need people within that age range, because that's the age when you can actually think and you can see that you can make a progressive suggestions and idea. So this continued for a period of 400 years in Africa. It was actually a very traumatized experience for us in Africa. So we have to appreciate, like what I said once ago, we have to appreciate the United Nations for at least for recognizing the fact that people from this part of the world actually suffered at a point in time, and they went through the trauma that they ought not to have gone through. But we shouldn't also deceive ourselves, because we all know that the reason why the economic the slave trade was actually became paramount was as a result of economic it was as a result of economic motive of the British and other countries from the West. Because at that time, you know, how it even started, let's even start from how it started in the first place. Slave trade started accidentally, actually, because in about 1500, what they were trying to do, they were trying to look for an alternative route from Europe to India, because they were looking for spices. It was in the course of passing through Africa that now realized that, look, that aside from selling gold and gold and cowries and all those other things to Africans, that we can actually sell, we can actually pay them and get their people and take them to all those countries where they have plantations. And it started that way. So it actually started as an economic reason, and even the abolition itself also has economic motive, because by 1800 it was no longer reasonable at that time to invest in human power, because industrial revolution has started and the machines had been produced. So the work that a slave could do in a farm, the machine, the work that probably 100 slaves would do in a day, machine will do it, will be able to accomplish it in the space of 10-20 minutes. So they now discovered that it was no longer reasonable. So they shouldn't. So it's unfortunate that till date, United Nations is still not looking at that part of the argument. They continue to make it look like it's because by 19th century that some set of people decided in Europe, like Abraham Lincoln and the rest, decided that, look, that enough was enough, that it was no, that it had become a moral burden for us to continue with the slave trade. But it wasn't so. It was because at that time they never saw the reason why they should continue with the investment. And at that time as well, they needed the African resources, they needed the raw materials. And where would the raw materials come from? Raw materials will only come from here, because we had the vegetation, we had the fertile land for them to be able to achieve that. That's why you see at that time they came to introduce cocoa, upper, a lot of other things that they actually need over there. And they need people, manpower in Africa to be able to man that. So as a result of that, they did not want people to keep leaving the African continent and to come over there. And that's why you see that beginning from 1830, in fact, they began to deal with a lot of African leaders who continued with the slave trade at the black market. What British and Americans did at that time was that they introduced a squadron, that's soldiers, and they planted them at the Atlantic for them to stop the movement of transportation of people. Trafficking of people, trafficking from Africa to the other countries. And the leaders who continued along that line, they dealt with them. People like Oba Kusoko from Lagos, people like Ovonrawe, a lot of them. So they actually dealt with them massively. But it was not because of the moral burden that it constituted to the British or the Americans, but it's because at that time they needed those individuals to remain in Africa for them to be able to work and to build on and to develop those raw materials and send them over there. That's why.
So you see that as mischief.
It was actually it has always been a mischief because the system has never been equal. It has never been fair to Africa. For example, look at it this way. Now, when you are bringing these raw materials, remember they make sure that in Africa, for example, that the only thing we could do was for us to develop these raw materials in the farm and everywhere, but we could not turn it into a finished product. Look at cocoa, for example. Now they brought cocoa into us. Now they introduced cocoa to us, and they told our leaders, especially those leaders, kings, chiefs, who had been involved in slave trade, who thought there was no other means of survival to slavery. So they introduced those things to them, and they made them understand that, look, that you are going to even make more money, that you are going to generate more revenue through this avenue. And they introduced that to them. But at the end of the day, they only taught them how to fish. They only give them the fish. They never taught us how to fish. So they made sure that by the time we finish the harvesting of the cocoa and other things from the farm, so we have to export it back to their country. Then where they are not going to turn it into a finished product. So it would have been even more cheaper for them, less expensive for them, if they actually bring those, if they actually introduce those industries in Africa. But they deliberately refuse to do that. So it has always been from one mischief to the other. So it has not really been fair to Africa when you look at the economic structure of the world and how we have been able to travel to this point.
Okay, so now you've said quite a number of things, and we're definitely going to drag out so many strings from all that you said in the last few minutes. But then, one would have thought that the Britons who, because you talked about mischief here, so one would have thought that the Britons and the colonial masters who enjoyed that during that slave trade time, that they would not even think of abolishing slave trade, that they would just want it to go on and on. So what exactly do you think that made them, because I hear you also say that we should be grateful to the UN for bringing up that abolition of slave trade. So what exactly do you think made them to have that reason or that mindset or conclusion that let's end slave trade in the 1800s?
Thank you. By 1785, it was already obvious in the international system that the direction of the world economy was changing.
Okay.
And that it was not going to remain the same again. Because at that time, we now had what we call industrial revolution in Europe, whereby they started introducing machines. A lot of inventors started developing different machines, especially farm tools. So like I said earlier, at that time, the work that 10 or 100, the work that 10 slaves would do,
one machine does it.
One machine will achieve it, even in the space of 10-20 minutes. So as a result of that, it was no longer economically viable. Remember that these slaves, they are not only going to be working, they are not only working at the farm, you also have to ensure that you feed them very well for them to be able to have the strength to continue with that job. So at that time, it was no longer economically viable. And don't also forget that even these slaves, that many of them, by the time they were about 60, 65, so they were no longer strong. So they will have to remain within their systems. So they now begin to see them as burdens. And don't forget that this system had continued for a period of 400 years, whereby you now had a lot of even old Africans within the systems who were no longer doing anything, and they were only relying and depending on the on their masters. So at that time, the masters, at that time, the bourgeoisie, they did not really see any reason why they had to continue with that. So that is the first reason. And the second reason why the system had to change, beginning from the late 18th century, was as a result of the fact that new things were also coming up. For example, before then, like I said, when they came to Africa in about 1500, when the Portuguese came, they were only looking for an alternative route to India. In fact, it was in the course of looking for an alternative route to India that made Spain to develop, to discover a country where they refer to as a new world that we now know as the United States of America. So it was in the course of all those things. So at that time, basically what they needed in Europe was spices. Spices is something like pepper and all that. So basically that was what they needed. Now, when they now came here, they now discovered that we actually had some of these things in abundance as well. So what they did was at that time, they did not see the reason why they should come into the interior, because remember that we had there was malaria, and it was killing a lot of them in large numbers. So they did not see reason why they should come into the interior. So what they would do at that time was to come into Africa, into the shores of Africa. Then from there, our leaders would take all the goods, all the things that were producing at that time, would take those things to them at the border. Then by the time they now discover that, look, that you can actually sell your people. In fact, they even deliberately encourage our leaders, the leaders at that time, to started witch hunting one another. So they started. So you just say that's why you see a community will just decide to wage war against another community and enslave all the able bodies there, and will take them to the shore and will sell them out. But beginning from the 18th century, things begin to change. So their need at that time was no longer spices. At that time, they need cotton. They were not producing cotton. At that time, what they were producing, they now began to produce Italian leather, Italian shoes, and they need Italian leather. And all these things, at that time in Africa, for example, up to today, we have what we call Katsina leather. That even has more quality. They even have more quality than what they are producing over there in Europe. So they now need all these things. And now they need cocoa, because in Britain, for example, even in America, they love coffee, tea, and all beverages. That. But they could not produce it over there. So they now realize that our land, African land, was actually fertile for something like this. So things were changing at that time, and these were the things that were in high demand in Europe at that time. If you are investors, if you are a business person, these were the areas that you are going to invest your money. So at that time, they realized that things were changing. It was no longer the plantation whereby you just have to work in a plant sugar cane. So it changed completely. So with that, they now had to start change. They now had to change their orientation. So that was the first step they did. The first step they took was for them to abolish that trade. Remember that even Britain, Britain could not even abolish it until about 1833. That was when Britain eventually abolished the slave trade. Now, for you to know that it had economic motive. Now, Britain abolished slave trade in 1833. Meanwhile, by 1860, Britain had already declared Lagos as a crown colony. So it shows that immediately after the slave trade, remember at that time too, the reason what prevented them from coming to the shore, to the interior, they've already discovered a solution to it, because malaria was killing them in large numbers by 1500. In fact, that was why by 1800 you could hardly see a single Portuguese at the shores of Africa, because at that time all of them had to flee. So because of the malaria that was killing them. But quinine was discovered in the early part of 19th century. So as a result of that, due to the effectiveness of quinine that helped them to prevent malaria, then they had to so they came to Africa with boldness. So it shows that if you are saying, for example, that slavery is a moral burden, then colonialism is even worse than even slavery, because now in terms of slavery, you are only enslaving some set of individuals, and you are taking them out of their countries. But in the case of colonialism, you are enslaving the entire continent, and you are enslaving the resources of that continent. You are not even allowing that the leaders and the citizens of that continent to even have a say in whatever happens in their country. That's why you see from that 1865 till about, look at what what happened between 1884 to 1885. They partitioned the entire countries of Africa. That's what they call Berlin Conference of 1884-1885. All of them came together, and this was the same set of individuals that were given the sharing trophies, given themselves accolade for abolishing slave trade. Yes, the same set of people came together in Berlin for 2 years, and they were fighting each other on how they were going to demarcate and they were going to partition and share the different territories of Africa among themselves. So which one is worse between colonialism and slavery?
Okay, so now, from taking a cue from where you just landed, I'll ask you two questions and I'd like you to unbundle them in one breath. Now, you earlier talked about people who, even as at this time, they were sold to those slave trade masters, but then at some point they had to even take up their own names. I've seen some persons that you just ask them, why you bearing that kind of name, and they'll tell you that because they were sold at some point, or they start giving you the history. So does it actually mean that? And I've even met someone who said that thank God my grandfather was sold at that point when he was sold and then taken to the European country, because I cannot deal with what is happening in Nigeria at the moment. So, one, do you think that we actually some people enjoy the fact that slave trade happened at some point, at that point that it happened, and then they were being sold out away from Nigeria? That's one. And then secondly, would you actually say that with the kind of relationship that is existing between the global south and the global north, the proverbial bourgeoisie and the proletariat, would you actually say that we are still currently suffering from economic slavery? Because if you look at, taking a cue from all that is happening with the Niger coup, with the Gabon coup, doesn't it actually mean that there's still some kind of slavery or the other?
Well, let me start with the first question. If you have read the account of virtually all the people who were taken out of their countries and they were enslaved, you know that none of them ever enjoyed it. In fact, you realize that a lot of them, especially those who were fortunate enough to work with the missionaries, like Ajayi Crowther, for example. I mentioned Olahuda Ikwano earlier, Mobola Agbebi, and a lot of them who later came back. You discover that none of them ever said that they enjoyed it, because there was nothing to enjoy in colonialism, in slavery. Now, the fact that even in slavery, if you read the account, Olahuda Ikwano was taken till date. It's late now for a long time, but Olahuda Ikwano never knew the country where he came from, because it was taken out as early as 5 years old, and his account showed that even as they were going, that thousands of people died in the ship, because they will have to travel through the ship for at times 3 months, 4 months, and they will continue, and a lot of people will be down. They will just throw them into the sea. So it was traumatic. And by the time they got there, then imagine a child of 6 years old, for example, that you have to start forcing to embark on hard labor on every day of his or her life. That's basically what they do. So there was nothing to enjoy in slavery. What you are referring to, I've also read some account like that. What you are referring to is the mentality of some of our people who came, and you cannot really blame, especially those who were saying now that they were glad that their forefathers were taken into slavery. Many of them have even successfully changed the history. There are quite of them that even many of them, their parents were not taken out of Africa, but their forefathers decided to embrace the foreigners' name, and they deliberately changed their names to foreign names to make it look like, okay, we came from this axis. And like why I say you cannot blame them is because many of the people who came, if you look at the mentality of Africa now, this our mindset of saying, okay, whatever is happening in our country, I just have to run out this Japa syndrome and all that. It has always been there. And it's as a result of how some people painted it to us. This issue of people preferring foreign goods, so it did not start today. It started way back, as far back as 19th century, when some of these fortunate slaves, I call them fortunate slaves because they did not die over there, and they still returned back to to the country where they took them from. Now, when they came, quite a good number of them began to brainwash our people. to make them feel like, oh, what you are doing here is wrong. And even missionaries participated in that. The likes of Ajayi Crowther, for example, came and they bastardized and they demonized our culture. They demonized virtually our way of life, and they made you feel like what you are doing was actually wrong, that this is actually the best way of life. Now people begin to have that mentality, especially those armchair researchers, those armchair researchers who never went there to actually see what they was to witness what they went through there. They now believe, and they started putting it down into writing, that that this thing was actually correct, that this was actually the acceptable way of life. So the missionaries contributed in that mentality. I mean, contributed in how people believe that that other way of life is actually the best. So but in the real sense of it, there was nothing to enjoy. Okay. All the people who came back, they were just those fortunate set of people. So that is that. Then on the second issue about the poverty, the prevailing poverty in Africa, and how and whether we are still in slavery. That argument has been on. In fact, as far back as 1970s, especially when we begin to have intellectuals in Africa, intellectuals who are learned, they've been argued that the argument has always been there that there should be reparation for Africa. What I mean by reparation is that if you look at the First World War, immediately after the First World War ended, because the First World War was started by Germany. Now the victorious countries at that time, led by France, so they came together, France, Britain, and other countries that were victorious, they came together. They now said for them to punish Germany, that Germany has to pay some amount of money as what they call it as reparation. Then aside from that, if you also look at the state of Israel, you realize that between up till about 10 years ago, Germany had paid Israel up to about $500 billion in reparation, not only in cash, even in kind and a lot of other things, just to make up for the atrocities that were committed and perpetrated against them by Adolf Hitler between 1933 and 1944, when about 5 million Jews were killed. So that's the reparation. And in Africa, people had been arguing, especially some scholars, they have been arguing that there should be some form of reparation for Africa. That if Africa is going through this cycle presently, if Africa is in this quagmire presently, that is as a result that you cannot separate that past from the present of Africa. That because development doesn't start in a day. That look at, if you are separating, if you say the slave trade doesn't matter, did not matter, it means that you are saying that 400 years of a continent's history did not actually matter. So, and there was, and at that time, like I said earlier, the argument was also that that the people who could have developed our country, who could have developed our continent at that time, they were the people that you took away to your country. And if you look at those countries, you realize that our people even contributed one way or the other to the development of those countries where they found themselves. So the argument was that that there should be some form of reparation. But like I said, another argument from the British side was that especially the western part was that we did not come to the interior. We didn't force your people to come to us. We paid your leaders. That your leaders could have used that money to actually develop your country. That nobody was taking, which was actually the truth. Nobody was taken out of Nigeria, for example. Let's limit it to Nigeria, for example. Nobody was taken out of Nigeria at that time free of charge. All those leaders collected money and they were paid. So that was the argument. And another argument is that it's not just even only about slavery, because immediately after slavery, then colonialism started. So the argument has always been that that whatever we are going through now, that colonialism also played a role in it, which we can actually refer to as even slavery as well. So that it played a role. But if you look at the argument again, was that a country like Congo, just as an example, that look at a country like Congo. Congo was colonized by Belgium, and we know that presently now, in terms of if you look at the United Nations Human Development Index, in about 180 countries, Congo is occupying about four position at the bottom of the ladder. It shows that for you to know how underdeveloped that country is. Now let's use that just one country, Congo, as an example. So they are saying that a country like Congo Congo was doing well, at least relatively well, before the arrival of Belgium.
Okay.
Congo was colonized by a country, Belgium. Meanwhile, Belgium, in terms of population, at that time, Belgium did not even have 20% of Congolese population. Now, Congo was colonized at that time. Now, according to the even the Belgian standard, the Western standard, even African standard, virtually everyone in Congo had a fair access to primary school education, but schooling beyond that almost become absolutely impossible.
Okay.
So it was not until 1946 that the first secondary school in Congo was established. Then in 1954 the first university in Congo was established, and the country eventually gained independence in 1960. So by the time Congo was gaining independence in 1960, Congo had only succeeded in producing 194 secondary school graduates and 16 university graduates out of a population of 12 million.
Oh, wow.
So the question is that how will a country move forward with that? But that argument has always been there. But now, if you now want to look at
we need to go on a break, because this conversation is actually getting more interesting. All right, viewers, let's go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll continue this conversation with Stephen Adewale. I'm sure you're enjoying this part, so you definitely see more after this time out. Join us again.
That was the time that Yakubu Gowon started building with them, because at that time the civil war just ended, and they proclaimed Operation 3Rs, that okay, that now there is no victor, there is no vanquish, that's okay, that there is going to be a reconstruction, there is going to be a rehabilitation, and there is going to be a reintegration. That was the 3Rs, and they embarked on massive project. They started building different army barracks everywhere. Then they started the building of a national theater at Igomu, the National Stadium at Surulere. They started building frivolous things. That was the time that Nigeria said, okay, that we're going to host the entire Africa on Festival of Arts and Culture, Festa 77.
So are you all that frivolities?
It was frivolities because if you look at the amount of, because it was an avenue for them to actually siphon money. If you trace the history of corruption in Nigeria, this was where our money went to. If you look at Ajakuta, for example, so they were just giving out all these things, and a lot of money were coming out through that. So we never prepared for the rainy season.
Welcome back. If you just joined us, this is The Conversation, reaching you from Kaftan's television studio here in the nation's capital, Abuja. If you just joined us, you've actually missed out on a whole lot. But then you can still join in the conversation, as my guest on the show today is Stephen Adewale, who is a historian, and we are commemorating International Day of Ending Slave Trade, or Abolition of Slave Trade. Okay, before you went on that break, you've actually talked about quite a number of things, and you ended at you were still talking about the Congo, but let's move a little bit, because there are quite a number of things we need to talk about, but our time is not our friend. In fact, this kind of conversations, times are never our friend. But then you just begin to wonder. Some would actually ask that, why is it that despite all, we still have African countries who would prefer to go cap in hand to seek assistance from the proverbial world power, either the bourgeoisies? They all still want to go and ask for loans, for grants, for vaccines. Because I recall the recent summit that was held, where you had the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, saying that in fact, insisting and categorically stating that Africans are not beggars. And the reason why he stated that was because during the COVID-19 pandemic that was ravaging the whole globally, the whole countries globally, they did not give priority to African countries. So he was stating that we are not beggars. And then some people stated that you are the one that is saying that you are not beggars. But why do you guys always behave like beggars when you see the white color, see the white people, or those who you term as your colonial masters? So with regards to that, and then you just begin to wonder, why is it that we have not shifted? Because I remember that song that was sung by I think it was Bob Marley, redemption song, that says, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Have we, even by ourselves as Africans, emancipated ourselves from mental slavery?
It's going to be difficult to achieve that, except we want to deceive ourselves. No matter how beautiful the rhetoric is, if we don't what we have been doing is just to take one step forward and about 8 steps backward.
Oh, wow.
We continue to allow our past history the past experience to affect us. And unfortunately, we continue to have leaders who also continue to perpetrate that, who continue to more ensure that that systems will continue in our polity. On the issue of what we are going through in Africa, whether we are beggars or we are not beggars. But the truth is that whatever Ramaphosa said or any other leader said is just rhetorics. The truth is that the kind of systems that they handed over to us, the kind of countries that they left behind when they were living, they never left countries that will end up becoming financially or economically independent. They left a country, they left countries that will continue to remain dependent.
Are you saying it's their fault?
It is. Let me give you an instance. Today, people who are, because people believe that we live in the continent where all of us are supposed to have short memories. So it's quite beautiful for people to come up and say, okay, this and give us different analysis without actually going into the past. But it has been clear that if you don't even know your past, if you don't know where you are coming from, you will not even understand how you get to this place. So if you don't know how you get here, then how will you know where you are going next? So that is the problem. Look at the Europe that we have today. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, between 1921, like I said earlier, after when the First World War ended in 1918, all the countries at that time, France, Britain, Italy, and also they came together. They said, oh, that France must pay reparation. At that time, United Nations was against it because United Nations felt that, look, that this thing will only succeed in hurting German's economy. But at the end of the day, France insisted. Despite the fact that Germany paid that reparation, now Adolf Hitler emerged. Now people supported him and Germany was able to bounce back. By the time Second World War started in 1938, the economy of Germany was way ahead virtually every other economy in Europe at that time. Now, by the time the Second World War now ended, virtually all the economy of Europe had been destroyed. What the United States of America did at that time was that they came up with what they call Marshall Plan. With that Marshall Plan, they gave out $38 billion. That was as at that time in 1945. So they gave out $38 billion, and they gave this money out to the European countries free of charge at no cost, without any mindset of getting it back from them. As a result of that, they made sure that all the technological facilities in their country, so they shipped them to Europe. So that is how economy of Europe was rebuilt in the space of 10 years. Now, they were able to achieve that. Now, let's now move to Africa. Let's place that experience by one side, and let's place the African experience, and let's weigh it on another side. When Africa was to gain independence, it was obvious at that time that Africa was lagging behind. Because before we gained independence, like I said, they only made us, it's not today that we have been selling without producing. Because that we have been buying without selling. And a country or a continent that buys without selling, it's not going to survive. So they made us reliable on them, because all the things that we produce here for them, the raw materials, then we take it back to their countries. They pay us. Meanwhile, they will turn it into a finished product, and they've already put us that mentality in us that, look, this is the best thing to do. You have to drink tea. You have to do this. You have to rely on this foreign gin, on this foreign drinks. Now that money they gave us, then they will now bring back those finished products, and they will not even sell it to us as twice as the money that they've already paid us earlier. So that was how they've been dealing with us before independence. Now, by the time we now gain independence, we were unfortunate in a way that we gained independence at the time of the Cold War, when there was an ideological rivalry between the West, led by the United States of America and Britain, and Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, that is known as Russia now, on the other side. So because of that Cold War, the Europe at that time never wanted an independent Africa that will move towards, that will end up moving towards Russia. So as a result of that, they never gave us any means to survive economically. Even in Nigeria, till tomorrow, till date, they keep saying that, oh, Awolowo did this, Awolowo did that. But what Awolowo was able to accomplish at that time was just the money revenue generated from cocoa, not from the finished product. All those things would have continued, assuming we have all those equipment, all those facilities here. So they continue to make us, so they've made us beggars right from the very beginning, and it has continued till date, and it will definitely continue.
Now, since you talked about how much they tell us that you need to drink tea, you need and here to keep shipping all of our raw materials there, you just begin to wonder. We call ourselves the oil-rich country, but yet we are not able to refine our own oil. And then you see, we just ship our crude oil there, and then they help us refine it, we return them back, thereby shipping our employment, shipping our FX, shipping almost everything. And then you see politicians who would just prefer to comfortably send their monies abroad, or store their monies or their gold and all abroad, instead of keeping them here in Nigeria because of one corruption case or the other. So with regards to where you landed, the last word you say, taking a cue from there, are you actually saying that we went wrong when we accepted democracy? Our problem started even before we embraced democracy. Democracy is just an ideology. Democracy will not, because if you look at all this governmental ideology, you realize that there are countries that are practicing the authoritarian system of government, and they are doing exceedingly well. But there are countries that practice the same dictatorial and authoritarian system of government, and they are far worse than democratic. There are countries that are democratically oriented countries, and we have also had countries that practice and embrace democracy, and they are worse for it. Nigeria is a case study, for example. But you know, people blame us, the analysts in Africa, for pointing accusing fingers at foreigners, at the Western leaders at every point in time. But the truth is that, like I said, as a student of history, you cannot actually divorce what has happened in the past to what we are going through at this very point in time. Look at our leaders. Yes, we cannot really blame them, because in Nigeria, when Nigeria gained independence in 1960, do you know that Singapore was yet to gain independence at that time? Malaysia at that time had to send their young foresight youth, had to send them to Nigeria. Then the same Singapore sent their policymakers to Nigeria. They came to study how we have been able to manage the income, the revenue being generated from oil, from groundnut, from palm oil, and all that. At that time, oil was not even discovered, and it was doing so well that by 1971, our leader, our head of state at that time, in the person of General Yakubu Gowon, went to Britain and made it clear and made it clear to the whole world that Nigeria's problem has nothing to do with money. That our problem was on how we're going to spend that money. Because at that time, our naira was equivalent to pounds. At that time, you don't even have to. At that time, you did not even have to go through. You did not have to go to UK and say you are staying there. Because what are you doing there? Because even those who are in Nigeria, many of them are even doing better than you. So a lot of them are coming back. At that time, you don't have to go to school. And you say, okay, you have to start thinking of what you are going to, of what you are going to do. I had a professor that made it clear to us, Professor Olorunfemi. He said, look, that Nigeria of my time was way better than this. During their own time, he said, the man graduated in 1974. He said when he graduated, he never had to think of what he was going to do. He said immediately he dropped his pen, that all he had to do was just to leave the class. From there, you will not even have to go to so you never have to go back to your hostel. That you just have to go to the car park. You see the state government already had the record of the students that they had in various universities. Then they will send vehicles to come and pick you. So all you just have to do is to be searching for your name. And he saw his name and he entered the Pidgeot 504, and from there they went to his hostel, they packed all his stuff. Then they took him from there without even taking him home. They took him to Ondo Boys High School where he was teaching. The same government sent him to UK for his masters. The same government sponsored his PhD. So Nigeria was. But don't we still have those same people alive till today? Why is it different? Now we had those same people alive today, but why it was so different was because at that time when other countries like Malaysia, like I mentioned earlier, when they were embarking on things that
are developmental in nature. And what we did at that time was just to be spending our money on frivolities. For example, it was at that time that we embarked on massive projects. Olufola wrote the book because Olufola at that time, that's the former presidential candidate, who also happened to be the former minister of finance. Olufola wrote the book because at that time he said in 1970 he was a director at the Ministry of Finance. When that was the time that Yakubu Gowon started building with them, because at that time the civil war just ended and they proclaimed Operation 3 Rs, that okay, that now there is no victor, there is no vanquish, that's okay, that there is going to be a reconstruction, there is going to be a rehabilitation, and there is going to be a reintegration. That was the 3 Rs, and they embarked on massive projects. They started building different army barracks everywhere. Then they started the building of National Theatre at Igomu, the National Stadium at Surulere. They started building frivolous things. That was the time that Nigeria started okay, that we're going to host the entire Africa on Festival of Arts and Culture, Festac 77.
So are you calling all that frivolities?
It was frivolities because if you look at the amount of, because it was an avenue for them to actually siphon money. If you trace the history of corruption in Nigeria, this was where our money went to. If you look at Ajakuta, for example, so they were just giving out all these things and a lot of money were coming out through that. So we never prepared for the rainy season. We never prepared for the rainy day. Unfortunately for Nigeria and other African countries, by the time because it was easier at that time for the United States of America to continue to manage all these leaders. But by the time the Cold War ended in 1989 and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic disintegrated, at that time United States of America knew that there was no other place for any country to run to. Yet what we had at that time was, instead of the bipolar world order that we used to have between 1945 and 1989, where two countries ruled the world, from 1989 what we now had was unipolar world order, where every country had to, whether you like it or not, you had to listen to America. So America had no reason to continue to sustain those leaders in power. But we continue to point those accusing figures because, like as in that 1960, in Nigeria, for example, leaders who were supposed to emerge, they were not even the people who emerged. They were not the people they handed power over to. If you now look at the history of Nigeria from that 1960, all the leaders that had emerged, they were especially from 1960 till about 1990, they were the leaders who never prepared for power. They were the leaders who never knew what they were even going to do in power. So they were there just because some power somewhere, especially in the West, felt that they would be more convenient and comfortable with these people. We mentioned Congo the other time. Look at what happened in Congo. Belgium, after independence, Belgium deliberately sponsored military coup for them to remove the socialist oriented leader that was in power, and they handed the power over to a military man who was there, Mobutu Sese Seko, who was there for 30 years and plundered the resources of the country. Now if you are now saying that all this money are in the West, the United States of America till date knew the record of where all the money is going to, where all these leaders are keeping the money. They are aware of it because they are the ones in control of all these resources. If they are saying we have Swiss bank where they keep the money, and the United States of America control virtually all the Swiss industry. So they knew where this money are going to. So if they actually want that development, if they want to replicate the kind of development that has happened in those other countries, then they can actually do it here. But it's unfortunate that we've had leaders, like I said, we cannot blame them for what we have gone through from 1970. We had no excuse in Nigeria, for example. We cannot blame them for what we have gone through, but we can as well blame them for handing over the country to the leaders who never prepared for power, who never knew what they were going to do with the power, who got there just because they felt that they came from that particular tribe of the country that were loyal to the British. So that is the problem.
Okay, so I hear you say because of the Americans, they already know where all these monies are. They know where they trace, how they can trace it to the Swiss banks and all. Then I remember someone saying that. Talking about the Abacha loot that keeps giving. So are you going to tie it to that also, that this Abacha loot that always keeps giving, never stops giving? Is it that the fact that they already know that it's still there? So let's be giving them small, like just like piecemeal.
There's a man who wrote a book. The man had worked with the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which you know as a World Bank. He has worked with, he started working with the bank very early in his life. He's not a Nigerian. He started working with them as far back as 1954, and he was there till about 1990 when the Civil War ended. Eventually, he wrote a book called The Confession of an Economic Hitman. In that book, he made series of confessions on how the leaders from the West, especially even all these United Nations agencies like IMF and UNO, how they always ensure that how they will even deliberately encourage African leaders to even involve in corruption. Because aside from the fact that they need the resources, remember that it's not just about when we're talking about slavery now, we're not just talking the dependence that we're talking about. It's not just about you taking our resources. This money too, they need the money. So another way for them to get that money is for them to encourage you to siphon the money that they will know that even the 10th generation will never have access to. So they deliberately did all that. So they knew where all those money went to. So they only wanted us to know. There are people in Nigeria today who are far richer, who looted the country's resources way more than what Abacha looted. But they wanted us at that time. If you look at the history of the country in the 1990s, you realize that what happened from 1993, especially after with the incarceration of MK Abiola, and now you know Abiola is also was a Western-oriented person. He was one of them. Are you getting my point? So if you now look at what happened from that 1994 when Abacha became the head of state, when with the series of human atrocities that were committed by Abacha till about 1990, you know that he and the other countries of the West, they were not on the same page. But yet, despite the fact that they were not on the same page, they were still the same individuals encouraging these people and show them ways on how they are going, where they were going to keep all those money. So why is it now easy for them to come out and say this was where the money? These were the places where the money were kept. They only wanted us to know about Abacha's loot because they were not on the same table outside of the table. If they had not wanted us to know, we would not have known. So they knew where all those money were. Ibrahim Babangida has been in power for a very long time, even before he became the head of state. He had been the man dictating the pace of things, and there had been a lot of allegations that had flown around everywhere. There was a book wrote by one retired army colonel, Debo Bashorun. The title of that book was that Honor for Sale. He detailed the history of the atrocities that were committed under Babangida even before he became the head of state, right from the 1970s. So up till 1993. So will you say that are they going to tell us that the corruption that was perpetrated by Abacha or under Abacha regime was more than Babangida regime? How come that we've never seen did you see
the interview that where he conducted and said that the corruption happening now is worse than what they had in their own time?
I don't want to believe that. Yes, corruption is with us now. But you know why it's looking like the corruption is everywhere now? What people don't understand is, what people need to understand rather, is this, that now we have a democratic system of government where a lot of people now have access to different things, but under the military, it is only the same with those few cabals, those few set of people who were placed at the side of authorities. They were the ones that were actually sitting around that money. You see, up till date, you see a retired captain who served under Babangida, and you see today that many of that they are multi-billionaires. So how much was their salaries during their service year? And don't forget that this was even the time when Naira was even still good. As at 1986, when Babangida embraced structural adjustment program, Naira at that time was equivalent to 4 Naira at that time. $1 was 4 Naira as at 1986. So it shows that if at that time, if $1 million were looted at that time, you can imagine what it will amount to presently.
All right. Our time is fast spent, and then we have a lot of things to talk about. But then I recall having a guest who said that Nigeria's problem started from structural adjustment program. In one word, do you agree?
Yes, I agree. It has started way before then, but it took a new turn with the embrace of structural adjustment program.
All right, so since we're talking about slave trade, you cannot actually leave this matter without talking about modern slavery. Now you have forced marriage, you have human trafficking, you have child labor, quite a number of them. So are we ever going to rid ourselves, Africans, Nigerians, or the whole world, can we ever rid ourselves? Can we completely rid ourselves and have this abolition of slave trade? Can it ever happen?
Well, ideally, all of us want to live in an ideal world. We want to live in a world where everything will be perfect, where everything will be going smoothly without any form of rancor, any form of deception and all that. But in reality, it's not going to be possible for us to achieve that. Like I said when we started, this issue of slavery has started from the time immemorial. But we can actually do more than what we are doing now. We can try as much as possible to reduce it to the barest minimum. Even the Holy Book, when the Holy Book was promising the children of Israel a lot of beautiful things, it got to a point said, okay, even at that promised land, that the poor shall not cease from the land. So it shows that there will still be individuals in the world who will still want to make money, who will still want to cheat, who will still want to trample on the rights of the downtrodden. So we'll continue to add them. So that's why I said earlier that aside from the countries doing more, then United Nations also need to do more. It's not just about proclaiming. Yes, they have been proclaiming and they have been upholding and they have been projecting the day since 1980. But now we now need to put those words into action. It's not just about saying it. We now need to put it and try as much as possible to reduce it into the barest minimum. It can only be reduced, but it cannot be totally eradicated.
Stephen Adewale, historian, it's been a wonderful time having this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right, viewers, I'm sure you've been rightly educated, entertained, and informed. It's been a wonderful time having this conversation. I have learned a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in. My guest today is Stephen Adewale, who is an historian. It's been a wonderful time here on The Conversation. Keep watching The Conversation because you never know who my next guest will be or what I will be speaking of next. Till I come your way again from the nation's capital, Abuja, I am Annabelle Oji. God bless you and yours. God bless Nigeria.